we've had a lot of very moving victim impact statements, I think, recently in a number of court cases, but the victim impact statement given by David French about his sister Valerie was really, really touching, I think, and it really showed the impact of a violent death like that on a whole family and then a whole network of people. Valerie French was killed by her husband, James Kilroy, who was convicted of life. But it was a complex case where we heard a lot about the plea of insanity.
Yes. Yeah, so basically James Kilroy pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity for murdering his wife, Valerie French, in 2019 in County Mayo. She was the murderer of their 3 children. There was evidence heard that basically a man was having his breakfast one day and saw this naked man in a field nearby. And when Gardaí caught up with him, he basically told him that he had killed his wife because she was working with Donald Trump supporters to plot against him. There was a mention of zombies as well. So they brought him to a nearby hospital where he was assessed, and then when they went to the home, they found Valerie's body. So obviously fast forward a few years and he went on trial. The prosecution's case was that he was suffering from cannabis-induced intoxication, which they don't think is an offence
under the
Mental Health Act.
Yeah, so I suppose it's one of these murder trials where, unlike other cases we've had, husband and wife, where a husband kills a wife, where the facts of the case weren't really in dispute. The fact that he killed her, that Valerie died a very violent death. She was, I think, stabbed and strangled.
Yes.
And that James Kilroy had done it wasn't in dispute. But what you had in dispute was really mostly focused around the state of his mind at the time and whether he could be found not guilty by reason of insanity. And a lot of it focused on his use of cannabis, really.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So there was basically psychiatry evidence given, and there was various experts who gave evidence, but there was some in dispute with others. So basically there was one psychiatrist, Dr. Ronan Mulroney, he diagnosed him with a cannabis-induced psychosis following years of cannabis use. So he was giving evidence on behalf of the defence, and he basically said he was suffering from a psychotic episode. But there was another psychiatrist, Dr. Harry Kennedy, who gave evidence, and he basically gave evidence on behalf of the state. And he said that cannabis-induced intoxication was not, he didn't believe that James Kilroy was suffering from a psychotic episode. He said it probably was cannabis-induced intoxication, but that was self-induced intoxication, which is not a defence under the current Mental Health Act. And he also believed that he was capable of knowing what he was doing to his wife was wrong. And then there was another psychiatrist who, Dr. Lisa Wooten, who disagreed with Harry Kennedy. She said that yes, it could be described as a cannabis-based intoxication, but that she would prefer to consider it as acute and transient psychosis. And she basically said that he wouldn't have been able to tell that what he was doing was wrong.
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose they certainly disagree on details of it. I mean, they all accept that cannabis played a role in his mental state at the time.
Yeah.
I suppose the defence of not guilty by reason of insanity, it hinges on, and it's obviously more complicated than this, but really that the person, when they committed the violent act, could not have known the difference between right and wrong. So that would be the core of why somebody could be found not guilty by reason of insanity. If they can have, even if they are impacted by mental illness, but they can be reasonably considered to have had a knowledge that what they were doing was wrong, that doesn't allow for that offence.
No.
So the cannabis induced psychosis bit, it's an interesting debate, because you heard there it said that it was self-induced, and I suppose it's the equivalent of if somebody attacked somebody when they were very, very drunk.
Yeah.
Most people, and obviously always in court, that's not accepted as a defence.
No.
It's not mitigation to say I killed my wife, but I was very drunk at the time and I can't really remember it. So I suppose they're making a comparison to cannabis with that.
Yeah, and I think the crux of it here is it was also basically they were trying to say you can't introduce cannabis-based intoxication under the it doesn't come into the wording of the Criminal Law and Sanity Act because it doesn't allow for a defence basically where a mental disorder is brought on by drug use, i.e. it's something that you have caused yourself by your use or your choice to take drugs. So basically following the conviction, Mr. Justice Hunt said that the jury was right to reject his defence on that basis, and that they think they only took 2 hours to reject it as well. So I think it's obviously a complex one in relation to cannabis intoxication, and he was obviously suffering from some kind of episode. Yeah. But I think the crux of it was that this should not actually be allowed as a defence because it was self-induced intoxication.
We also heard during the case how James Kilroy had been treated for cannabis, mental health issues related to cannabis use back in 2001.
Yeah. And
the judge, after the verdict was reached, he said that the use of cannabis cannot be considered a risk-free zone. And the fact that James Kilroy had previously been treated for cannabis could therefore be reasonably considered to have knowledge of the damage it could do. Like that also adds a layer of, I suppose, culpability. I mean, if he had all of a sudden found himself in this circumstance where his mental health was out of control without any warning, that might have been considered differently. But the fact is that he had at least been treated for it and therefore knew that he was at least putting himself at risk by using cannabis in this way.
Yeah, and I suppose Dr. Professor Harry Kennedy, when he was giving evidence called by the prosecution, he did say that he didn't see any symptoms of a schizophrenia type illness. So the only thing he could basically summarise was that it was cannabis-based intoxication, which, as you just said there, that's not without your own doing in a way. And I suppose what strengthens probably the case as well was that the trial heard how after Gardaí apprehended Kilroy before they discovered Valerie's body, he was taken to a psychiatric unit in Castlebar and he was assessed under the Mental Health Act, and the psychiatrist on call told the trial that he had lacerations and bruising on his arms and back. And he said that he'd been stabbed by his wife. There was no stab wound found, but she described various disillusional beliefs. He said he was on a mission from God to kill his wife and things like that. She said that he said the year was 2024 when it was actually 2019. But at the same time, she wasn't able to find any evidence of a mental disorder. And she said he didn't meet the criteria for detention under the Mental Health Act. And he was actually released into Garda custody. So I suppose that strengthened the case because he wasn't detained. And actually very shortly after he entered the prison system, he was released into the general population. So it wasn't assessed by experts that he needed to be detained in a special unit or anything like that.
And obviously the other psychiatrist said it was a transient condition in that once you stop and taking cannabis, any psychosis departs, unlike somebody who suffers from schizophrenia where it's a lifelong condition, whether it's been exacerbated by drug use or not, the condition remains. And that clearly nobody is saying that he suffers from schizophrenia.
No, not at all. And I suppose the psychiatrist that gave evidence called by the defence, who believed that it was an acute and transient psychosis, she did say that she believed that a factor in this, and obviously he had said to Gardaí that he thought that Valerie was conspiring with Trump supporters, and that he had actually 9 days before the murder, Kilroy had attended an anti-Trump protest. So she was kind of saying that she felt that this may have been an example of, his psychosis, and that he actually wasn't found to have any cannabis in his system. In the days, there was 2 toxicology experts who gave evidence that urine and blood tests didn't find any cannabis in his system. So I suppose that was that was evidence used by the defence to show that it was a psychosis, but it wasn't necessarily brought on by the cannabis that it wasn't just cannabis intoxication, basically, that he maybe had started that way, but that had resulted in his inability to know, what was going on or what he was doing was right.
So I think I remember at the time when the murder occurred, I remember Valerie French being buried, and I remember her brother at the time, David, saying that they asking people to pray for her killer, effectively. And I suppose when he spoke outside court, he also reflected on that moment. And he said that while he did say that at the time, that there can now, he understands there can be no forgiveness and no forgetting what happened.
No.
He painted a really good picture of her, because I think initially Valerie French was really painted as somebody kind of mild-mannered, and maybe she wasn't maybe portrayed as a kind of a strong personality. And her brother said that she was extremely capable, a talented, loving mother who literally gave everything to her kids. He expressed his fear that when the kids were adults, they would his hope that they would learn the full story with all the inhumane and horrifying details. He also spoke about how he believed James Kilroy had kind of attempted to control the narrative following his wife's murder, where he, I suppose, and we don't know the ins and outs necessarily of it, but certainly managed to successfully portray himself as being a victim, I suppose, somebody that couldn't have known any different. And David he kind of wanted to make it really clear the long-lasting impact of the actions, because he spoke about how his mother effectively died of a broken heart. He said that it felt like Valerie was murdered again every morning when he woke and realised that it really happened. And the quote was, "It was agony then and it is agony now."
Yeah, and he also pointed out that there's been never any remorse in any form shown towards the family. And I suppose, going back to what you said, in all murder trials, we see how, unfortunately, the victim can sometimes get lost among the evidence, but particularly in this case, because there was such conflict in relation to evidence that the jury was hearing about this cannabis-induced intoxication, that was really the centre of the trial. And obviously then, that is, I can understand why that would, in relation to what he was saying about how it became all about James Kilroy, and that, he created this narrative because obviously he was trying to put forward this defence, and the family obviously have their own views of what happened, and it's essentially taking away from the truth.
Exactly, and they put it very much in the context of domestic violence cases that have occurred. I think they mentioned some cases like the murder of Jenny Poole and a couple of others. And that was the context in which they see this case, the murder of Valerie French. They don't see it as a case involving a psychotic breakdown.
No.
They see it in the context of somebody being controlled and ultimately meeting a violent death at the hands of their husband.
Yeah.
And James, I think he described it really, the impact on them. He's described having to continually work to contain a frightening level of anger and sheer rage at what the killer had done. Yeah,
and I suppose when you strip it all back, because we've been talking about it there, you do sort of get distracted by this, the arguments over the defence of intoxication. But when you strip it all back, it is a case of obviously a domestic violence incident. This man, she went out, they had a row, she went out with friends and came home and he murdered her, and it was the savage injuries that she sustained. She actually was stabbed in the throat, but also there was ligature strangulation, and it was also given evidence that she would have the blood loss from her hands because she was defending herself. That actually would have contributed to her death. That was how violent it was, and I think the children were in the house at the time as well. So when you focus on those specific details, it is a hallmark case of a horrific domestic violence murder. And the family are dead right in that, they were asking for, anybody in those situations to look for help, because that wasn't being focused on, and of course it should be.
Like they also described, I suppose, the ripple effect, as I said, where he says crimes like this have a ripple effect on relationships, employment and health. Our children have been deeply traumatized by the sudden loss of their beloved Aunt Valerie and haunted by thoughts of the killer, who we welcomed into our family and as a guest into our homes. And that's, of course, the deeply traumatic effect of these inter-family killings, that it just ripples out and there is no escaping from it.
Yeah, and that's what they said. They're living a nightmare, basically. But Mr. Justice Tony Hunt is obviously very experienced in the court. He described it as one of the most impressive and eloquent he's ever heard, and obviously expresses the damage caused, because, there's not many of us can understand the true, pain and agony that's caused when someone close to you is murdered like that. But they really got it across, and they're serving their own life sentence obviously as well. So
yeah, look, it's really tough for the families, but it is important, these victim impact statements. We see them again and again, what they can do to, I suppose, reframe a crime. And it must be tough on a family to have to go and speak publicly, but
yeah, absolutely,
it certainly makes you think again about the case when you listen to them.
Yeah.
So James Kilroy will serve a life sentence. How long that is not determined yet.
No.
But it's a case we may come back to and speak about again if there's appeals or further information comes out.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thanks very much, Eimear.
No problem. Thanks, Niall.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.